Louis Althusser 1970. Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays. Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Notes Towards an Investigation. First published, in La Pensée, 1970. Translated, from the French by Ben Brewster. Source, Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays, Monthly Review Press 1971. Transcribed, by Andy Blunden. On the reproduction of the conditions of production 1. I must now expose more fully something which was briefly glimpsed in my analysis when I spoke of the necessity to renew the means of production if production is to be possible. That was a passing hint. Now I shall consider it for itself. As Marx said, every child knows that a social formation which did not reproduce the conditions of production at the same time as it produced would not last a year. 2. The ultimate condition of production is therefore the reproduction of the conditions of production. This may be simple, reproducing exactly the previous conditions of production, or on an extended scale, expanding them. Let us ignore this last distinction for the moment. What, then, is the reproduction of the conditions of production? Here we are entering a domain which is both very familiar, since Capital Volume 2, and uniquely ignored. The tenacious obviousnesses, ideological obviousnesses of an empiricist type, of the point of view of production alone, or even of that of mere productive practice, itself abstract in relation to the process of production, are so integrated into our everyday consciousness that it is extremely hard, not to say almost impossible, to raise oneself to the point of view of reproduction. Nevertheless, everything outside this point of view remains abstract, worse than one-sided, distorted, even at the level of production, and, a fortiori, at that of mere practice. Let us try and examine the matter methodically. To simplify my exposition, and assuming that every social formation arises from a dominant mode of production, I can say that the process of production sets to work the existing productive forces in and under definite relations of production. It follows that, in order to exist, every social formation must reproduce the conditions of its production at the same time as it produces, and in order to be able to produce, it must therefore reproduce. 1. The productive forces. 2. The existing relations of production. Reproduction of the means of production. Everyone, including the bourgeois economists whose work is national accounting, or the modern macroeconomic theoreticians, now recognizes, because Marx compellingly proved it in Capital Volume 2, that no production is possible which does not allow for the reproduction of the material conditions of production, the reproduction of the means of production. The average economist, who is no different in this than the average capitalist, knows that each year it is essential to foresee what is needed to replace what has been used up or worn out in production, raw material, fixed installations, buildings, instruments of production, machines, etc. I say the average economist equals the average capitalist, for they both express the point of view of the firm, regarding it as sufficient simply to give a commentary on the terms of the firm's financial accounting practice. But thanks to the genius of Quesnay who first posed this glaring problem, and to the genius of Marx who resolved it, we know that the reproduction of the material conditions of production cannot be thought at the level of the firm, because it does not exist at that level in its real conditions. What happens at the level of the firm is an effect, which only gives an idea of the necessity of reproduction, but absolutely fails to allow its conditions and mechanisms to be thought. A moment's reflection is enough to be convinced of this. Mr. X, a capitalist who produces woolen yarn in his spinning mill, has to reproduce his raw material, his machines, etc. But he does not produce them for his own production, other capitalists do. An Australian sheep farmer, Mr. Y, a heavy engineer producing machine tools, Mr. Z, etc., etc. And Mr. Y and Mr. Z, in order to produce those products which are the condition of the reproduction of Mr. X's conditions of production, also have to reproduce the conditions of their own production, and so on to infinity, the whole in proportions such that, on the national and even the world market, the demand for means of production, for reproduction, can be satisfied by the supply. In order to think this mechanism, which leads to a kind of endless chain, it is necessary to follow Marx's global procedure, and to study in particular the relations of the circulation of capital between Department I, production of means of production, and Department II, production of means of consumption, and the realization of surplus value, in Capital, volumes 2 and 3. We shall not go into the analysis of this question. It is enough to have mentioned the existence of the necessity of the reproduction of the material conditions of production. Reproduction of labor power. However, the reader will not have failed to note one thing. We have discussed the reproduction of the means of production, but not the reproduction of the productive forces. We have therefore ignored the reproduction of what distinguishes the productive forces from the means of production, i.e. the reproduction of labor power. From the observation of what takes place in the firm, in particular from the examination of the financial accounting practice which predicts amortization and investment, we have been able to obtain an approximate idea of the existence of the material process of reproduction, but we are now entering a domain in which the observation of what happens in the firm is, if not totally blind, at least almost entirely so, and for good reason. The reproduction of labor power takes place essentially outside the firm. How is the reproduction of labor power ensured? It is ensured by giving labor power the material means with which to reproduce itself, by wages. Wages feature in the accounting of each enterprise, but as wage capital 3, not at all as a condition of the material reproduction of labor power. However, that is in fact how it works, since wages represents only that part of the value produced by the expenditure of labor power which is indispensable for its reproduction, so indispensable to the reconstitution of the labor power of the wage earner, the wherewithal to pay for housing, food, and clothing, in short to enable the wage earner to present himself again at the factory gate the next day, and every further day God grants him, and we should add, indispensable for raising and educating the children in whom the proletarian reproduces himself, in n models where n equals 0, 1, 2, etc., as labor power. Remember that this quantity of value, wages, necessary for the reproduction of labor power is determined not by the needs of a biological guaranteed minimum wage, salaire minimum interprofessional guarantee, alone, but by the needs of a historical minimum. Marx noted that English workers need beer while French proletarians need wine, i.e. a historically variable minimum. I should also like to point out that this minimum is doubly historical in that it is not defined by the historical needs of the working class recognized by the capitalist class, but by the historical needs imposed by the proletarian class struggle, a double class struggle, against the lengthening of the working day and against the reduction of wages. However, it is not enough to ensure for labor power the material conditions of its reproduction if it is to be reproduced as labor power. I have said that the available labor power must be competent, i.e. suitable to be set to work in the complex system of the process of production. The development of the productive forces and the type of unity historically constitutive of the productive forces at a given moment produce the result that the labor power has to be, diversely, skilled and therefore reproduced as such. Diversely, according to the requirements of the socio-technical division of labor, its different jobs and posts. How is this reproduction of the diversified skills of labor power provided for in a capitalist regime? Here, unlike social formations characterized by slavery or serfdom, this reproduction of the skills of labor power tends, this is a tendential law, decreasingly to be provided for on the spot, apprenticeship within production itself, but is achieved more and more outside production, by the capitalist education system, and by other instances and institutions. What do children learn at school? They go varying distances in their studies, but at any rate they learn to read, to write, and to add, i.e. a number of techniques, and a number of other things as well, including elements, which may be rudimentary or on the contrary thoroughgoing, of scientific or literary culture, which are directly useful in the different jobs in production, one instruction for manual workers, another for technicians, a third for engineers, a final one for higher management, etc. Thus they learn know-how. But besides these techniques and knowledges, and in learning them, children at school also learn the rules of good behavior, i.e. the attitude that should be observed by every agent in the division of labor, according to the job he is destined for, rules of morality, civic and professional conscience, which actually means rules of respect for the socio-technical division of labor and ultimately the rules of the order established by class domination. They also learn to speak proper French, to handle the workers correctly, i.e. actually, for the future capitalists and their servants, to order them about properly, i.e., ideally, to speak to them in the right way, etc. To put this more scientifically, I shall say that the reproduction of labor power requires not only a reproduction of its skills, but also, at the same time, a reproduction of its submission to the rules of the established order, i.e. a reproduction of submission to the ruling ideology for the workers, and a reproduction of the ability to manipulate the ruling ideology correctly for the agents of exploitation and repression, so that they, too, will provide for the domination of the ruling class in words. In other words, the school, but also other state institutions like the church, or other apparatuses like the army, teaches know-how, but in forms which ensure subjection to the ruling ideology or the mastery of its practice. All the agents of production, exploitation, and repression, not to speak of the professionals of ideology, Marx, must in one way or another be steeped in this ideology in order to perform their tasks conscientiously, the tasks of the exploited, the proletarians, of the exploiters, the capitalists, of the exploiters' auxiliaries, the managers, or of the high priests of the ruling ideology, its functionaries, etc. The reproduction of labor power thus reveals as its sine qua non not only the reproduction of its skills but also the reproduction of its subjection to the ruling ideology or of the practice of that ideology, with the proviso that it is not enough to say not only but also, for it is clear that it is in the forms and under the forms of ideological subjection that provision is made for the reproduction of the skills of labor power. But this is to recognize the effective presence of a new reality, ideology. Here I shall make two comments. The first is to round off my analysis of reproduction. I have just given a rapid survey of the forms of the reproduction of the productive forces, i.e. of the means of production on the one hand, and of labor power on the other. But I have not yet approached the question of the reproduction of the relations of production. This is a crucial question for the Marxist theory of the mode of production. To let it pass would be a theoretical omission, worse, a serious political error. I shall therefore discuss it. But in order to obtain the means to discuss it, I shall have to make another long detour. The second comment is that in order to make this detour, I am obliged to re-raise my old question, what is a society? Infrastructure and superstructure. On a number of occasions I have insisted on the revolutionary character of the Marxist conception of the social whole insofar as it is distinct from the Hegelian totality. I said, and this thesis only repeats famous propositions of historical materialism, that Marx conceived the structure of every society as constituted by levels or instances articulated by a specific determination, the infrastructure, or economic base, the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production, and the superstructure, which itself contains two levels or instances, the politico-legal, law and the state, and ideology, the different ideologies, religious, ethical, legal, political, etc. Besides its theoretico-didactic interest, it reveals the difference between Marx and Hegel. This representation has the following crucial theoretical advantage: it makes it possible to inscribe in the theoretical apparatus of its essential concepts what I have called their respective indices of effectivity. What does this mean? It is easy to see that this representation of the structure of every society as an edifice containing a base, infrastructure, on which are erected the two floors of the superstructure, is a metaphor, to be quite precise, a spatial metaphor, the metaphor of a topography, topaki. 5. Like every metaphor, this metaphor suggests something, makes something visible. What? Precisely this, that the upper floors could not stay up, in the air, alone, if they did not rest precisely on their base. Thus the object of the metaphor of the edifice is to represent above all the determination in the last instance by the economic base. The effect of this spatial metaphor is to endow the base with an index of effectivity known by the famous terms, the determination in the last instance of what happens in the upper floors of the superstructure, by what happens in the economic base. Given this index of effectivity in the last instance, the floors of the superstructure are clearly endowed with different indices of effectivity. What kind of indices? It is possible to say that the floors of the superstructure are not determinant in the last instance, but that they are determined by the effectivity of the base, that if they are determinant in their own, as yet undefined, ways, this is true only insofar as they are determined by the base. Their index of effectivity, or determination, as determined by the determination in the last instance of the base, is thought by the Marxist tradition in two ways. 1. There is a relative autonomy of the superstructure with respect to the base. 2. There is a reciprocal action of the superstructure on the base. We can therefore say that the great theoretical advantage of the Marxist topography, i.e. of the spatial metaphor of the edifice, base and superstructure, is simultaneously that it reveals that questions of determination, or of index of effectivity, are crucial, that it reveals that it is the base which in the last instance determines the whole edifice, and that, as a consequence, it obliges us to pose the theoretical problem of the types of derivatory effectivity peculiar to the superstructure, i.e. it obliges us to think what the Marxist tradition calls conjointly the relative autonomy of the superstructure and the reciprocal action of the superstructure on the base. The greatest disadvantage of this representation of the structure of every society by the spatial metaphor of an edifice, is obviously the fact that it is metaphorical, i.e. it remains descriptive. It now seems to me that it is possible and desirable to represent things differently. N.B. I do not mean by this that I want to reject the classical metaphor, for that metaphor itself requires that we go beyond it. And I am not going beyond it in order to reject it as outworn. I simply want to attempt to think what it gives us in the form of a description. I believe that it is possible and necessary to think what characterizes the essential of the existence and nature of the superstructure on the basis of reproduction. Once one takes the point of view of reproduction, many of the questions whose existence was indicated by the spatial metaphor of the edifice, but to which it could not give a conceptual answer, are immediately illuminated. My basic thesis is that it is not possible to pose these questions, and therefore to answer them, except from the point of view of reproduction. I shall give a short analysis of law, the state, and ideology from this point of view. And I shall reveal what happens both from the point of view of practice and production on the one hand, and from that of reproduction on the other. The state. The Marxist tradition is strict, here, in the Communist Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire, and in all the later classical texts, above all in Marx's writings on the Paris Commune and Lenin's on State and Revolution, the state is explicitly conceived as a repressive apparatus. The state is a machine of repression, which enables the ruling classes, in the 19th century the bourgeois class and the class of big landowners, to ensure their domination over the working class, thus enabling the former to subject the latter to the process of surplus value extortion, i.e. to capitalist exploitation. The state is thus first of all what the Marxist classics have called the state apparatus. This term means, not only the specialized apparatus, in the narrow sense, whose existence and necessity I have recognized in relation to the requirements of legal practice, i.e. the police, the courts, the prisons, but also the army, which, the proletariat has paid for this experience with its blood, intervenes directly as a supplementary repressive force in the last instance, when the police and its specialized auxiliary corps are outrun by events, and above this ensemble, the head of state. The government and the administration. Presented in this form, the Marxist-Leninist theory of the state has its finger on the essential point, and not for one moment can there be any question of rejecting the fact that this really is the essential point. The state apparatus, which defines the state as a force of repressive execution and intervention in the interests of the ruling classes in the class struggle conducted by the bourgeoisie and its allies against the proletariat, is quite certainly the state, and quite certainly defines its basic function. From descriptive theory to theory as such. Nevertheless, here too, as I pointed out with respect to the metaphor of the edifice, infrastructure and superstructure, this presentation of the nature of the state is still partly descriptive. As I shall often have occasion to use this adjective, descriptive, a word of explanation is necessary in order to remove any ambiguity. Whenever, in speaking of the metaphor of the edifice or of the Marxist theory of the state, I have said that these are descriptive conceptions or representations of their objects, I had no ulterior critical motives. On the contrary, I have every grounds to think that great scientific discoveries cannot help but pass through the phase of what I shall call descriptive theory. This is the first phase of every theory, at least in the domain which concerns us, that of the science of social formations. As such, one might, and in my opinion one must, envisage this phase as a transitional one, necessary to the development of the theory. That it is transitional is inscribed in my expression, descriptive theory, which reveals in its conjunction of terms the equivalent of a kind of contradiction. In fact, the term theory clashes to some extent with the adjective descriptive which I have attached to it. This means quite precisely, 1. That the descriptive theory really is, without a shadow of a doubt, the irreversible beginning of the theory, but, 2. That the descriptive form in which the theory is presented requires, precisely as an effect of this contradiction, a development of the theory which goes beyond the form of description. Let me make this idea clearer by returning to our present object, the state. When I say that the Marxist theory of the state available to us is still partly descriptive, that means first and foremost that this descriptive theory is without the shadow of a doubt precisely the beginning of the Marxist theory of the state, and that this beginning gives us the essential point, i.e. the decisive principle of every later development of the theory. Indeed, I shall call the descriptive theory of the state correct, since it is perfectly possible to make the vast majority of the facts in the domain with which it is concerned correspond to the definition it gives of its object. Thus, the definition of the state as a class state, existing in the repressive state apparatus, casts a brilliant light on all the facts observable in the various orders of repression whatever their domains, from the massacres of June 1848 and of the Paris Commune, of Bloody Sunday May 1905 in Petrograd, of the Resistance, of Quran, etc., to the mere, and relatively anodyne, interventions of a censorship which has banned Diderot's La Religieuse or a play by Gatti on Franco. It casts light on all the direct or indirect forms of exploitation and extermination of the masses of the people, imperialist wars. It casts light on that subtle everyday domination beneath which can be glimpsed, in the forms of political democracy, for example, what Lenin, following Marx, called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And yet the descriptive theory of the state represents a phase in the constitution of the theory which itself demands the supersession of this phase. For it is clear that if the definition in question really does give us the means to identify and recognize the facts of oppression by relating them to the state, conceived as the repressive state apparatus, this interrelationship gives rise to a very special kind of obviousness, about which I shall have something to say in a moment. Yes, that's how it is, that's really true. 6. And the accumulation of facts within the definition of the state may multiply examples, but it does not really advance the definition of the state, i.e. the scientific theory of the state. Every descriptive theory thus runs the risk of blocking the development of the theory, and yet that development is essential. That is why I think that, in order to develop this descriptive theory into theory as such, i.e. in order to understand further the mechanisms of the state in its functioning, I think that it is indispensable to add something to the classical definition of the state as a state apparatus. The essentials of the Marxist theory of the state. Let me first clarify one important point. The state, and its existence in its apparatus, has no meaning except as a function of state power. The whole of the political class struggle revolves around the state. By which I mean around the possession, i.e. the seizure and conservation of state power by a certain class or by an alliance between classes or class fractions. This first clarification obliges me to distinguish between state power, conservation of state power or seizure of state power, the objective of the political class struggle on the one hand, and the state apparatus on the other. We know that the state apparatus may survive, as is proved by bourgeois revolutions in 19th century France, 1830, 1848, by coups d'état, December 2, May 1958, by collapses of the state, the fall of the empire in 1870, of the Third Republic in 1940, or by the political rise of the petty bourgeoisie, 1890–95 in France, etc., without the state apparatus being affected or modified. It may survive political events which affect the possession of state power. Even after a social revolution like that of 1917, a large part of the state apparatus survived after the seizure of state power by the alliance of the proletariat and the small peasantry. Lenin repeated the fact again and again. It is possible to describe the distinction between state power and state apparatus as part of the Marxist theory of the state, explicitly present since Marx's 18th Brumaire and class struggles in France. To summarize the Marxist theory of the state on this point, it can be said that the Marxist classics have always claimed that, 1. The state is the repressive state apparatus, 2. State power and state apparatus must be distinguished, 3. The objective of the class struggle concerns state power, and in consequence the use of the state apparatus by the classes, or alliance of classes or of fractions of classes, holding state power as a function of their class objectives, and, 4. The proletariat must seize state power in order to destroy the existing bourgeois state apparatus and, in a first phase, replace it with a quite different, proletarian, state apparatus, then in later phases set in motion a radical process, that of the destruction of the state, the end of state power, the end of every state apparatus. In this perspective, therefore, what I would propose to add to the Marxist theory of the state is already there in so many words. But it seems to me that even with this supplement, this theory is still in part descriptive, although it does now contain complex and differential elements whose functioning and action cannot be understood without recourse to further supplementary theoretical development. The state ideological apparatuses. Thus, what has to be added to the Marxist theory of the state is something else. Here we must advance cautiously in a terrain which, in fact, the Marxist classics entered long before us, but without having systematized in theoretical form the decisive advances implied by their experiences and procedures. Their experiences and procedures were indeed restricted in the main to the terrain of political practice. In fact, i.e. in their political practice, the Marxist classics treated the state as a more complex reality than the definition of it given in the Marxist theory of the state, even when it has been supplemented as I have just suggested. They recognized this complexity in their practice, but they did not express it in a corresponding theory. 7. I should like to attempt a very schematic outline of this corresponding theory. To that end, I propose the following thesis. In order to advance the theory of the state, it is indispensable to take into account not only the distinction between state power and state apparatus, but also another reality which is clearly on the side of the repressive state apparatus, but must not be confused with it. I shall call this reality by its concept, the ideological state apparatuses. What are the ideological state apparatuses, ISAs? They must not be confused with the repressive state apparatus. Remember that in Marxist theory, the state apparatus, SA, contains the government, the administration, the army, the police, the courts, the prisons, etc., which constitute what I shall in future call the repressive state apparatus. Repressive suggests that the state apparatus in question functions by violence, at least ultimately, since repression, e.g. administrative repression, may take non-physical forms. I shall call ideological state apparatuses a certain number of realities which present themselves to the immediate observer in the form of distinct and specialized institutions. I propose an empirical list of these which will obviously have to be examined in detail, tested, corrected and reorganized. With all the reservations implied by this requirement, we can for the moment regard the following institutions as ideological state apparatuses. The order in which I have listed them has no particular significance. The religious ISA, the system of the different churches. The educational ISA, the system of the different public and private schools. The family ISA 8. The legal ISA 9. The political ISA, the political system, including the different parties. The trade union ISA. The communications ISA, press, radio, and television, etc. The cultural ISA, literature, the arts, sports, etc. I have said that the ISAs must not be confused with the repressive state apparatus. What constitutes the difference? As a first moment, it is clear that while there is one repressive state apparatus, there is a plurality of ideological state apparatuses. Even presupposing that it exists, the unity that constitutes this plurality of ISAs as a body is not immediately visible. As a second moment, it is clear that whereas the unified, repressive, state apparatus belongs entirely to the public domain, much the larger part of the ideological state apparatuses, in their apparent dispersion, are part, on the contrary, of the private domain. Churches, parties, trade unions, families, some schools, most newspapers, cultural ventures, etc., etc., are private. We can ignore the first observation for the moment. But someone is bound to question the second, asking me by what right I regard as ideological state apparatuses, institutions which for the most part do not possess public status, but are quite simply private institutions. As a conscious Marxist, Gramsci already forestalled this objection in one sentence. The distinction between the public and the private is a distinction internal to bourgeois law, and valid in the subordinate domains in which bourgeois law exercises its authority. The domain of the state escapes it because the latter is above the law. The state, which is the state of the ruling class, is neither public nor private. On the contrary, it is the precondition for any distinction between public and private. The same thing can be said from the starting point of our state ideological apparatuses. It is unimportant whether the institutions in which they are realized are public or private. What matters is how they function. Private institutions can perfectly well function as ideological state apparatuses. A reasonably thorough analysis of any one of the ISAs proves it. But now for what is essential. What distinguishes the ISAs from the repressive state apparatus is the following basic difference: the repressive state apparatus functions by violence, whereas the ideological state apparatuses function by ideology. I can clarify matters by correcting this distinction. I shall say rather that every state apparatus, whether repressive or ideological, functions both by violence and by ideology, but with one very important distinction which makes it imperative not to confuse the ideological state apparatuses with the repressive state apparatus. This is the fact that the repressive state apparatus functions massively and predominantly by repression, including physical repression, while functioning secondarily by ideology. There is no such thing as a purely repressive apparatus. For example, the army and the police also function by ideology, both to ensure their own cohesion and reproduction, and in the values they propound externally. In the same way, but inversely, it is essential to say that for their part the ideological state apparatuses function massively and predominantly by ideology, but they also function secondarily by repression, even if ultimately, but only ultimately, this is very attenuated and concealed, even symbolic. There is no such thing as a purely ideological apparatus. Thus schools and churches use suitable methods of punishment, expulsion, selection, etc., to discipline not only their shepherds, but also their flocks. The same is true of the family. The same is true of the cultural apparatus, censorship, among other things, etc. Is it necessary to add that this determination of the double functioning, predominantly, secondarily, by repression and by ideology, according to whether it is a matter of the repressive state apparatus or the ideological state apparatuses, makes it clear that very subtle explicit or tacit combinations may be woven from the interplay of the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses. Everyday life provides us with innumerable examples of this, but they must be studied in detail if we are to go further than this mere observation. Nevertheless, this remark leads us towards an understanding of what constitutes the unity of the apparently disparate body of the Isas. If the Isas function massively and predominantly by ideology, what unifies their diversity is precisely this functioning, insofar as the ideology by which they function is always in fact unified, despite its diversity and its contradictions, beneath the ruling ideology, which is the ideology of the ruling class. Given the fact that the ruling class in principle holds state power, openly or more often by means of alliances between classes or class fractions, and therefore has at its disposal the repressive state apparatus, we can accept the fact that this same ruling class is active in the ideological state apparatuses insofar as it is ultimately the ruling ideology which is realized in the ideological state apparatuses, precisely in its contradictions. Of course, it is a quite different thing to act by laws and decrees in the repressive state apparatus and to act through the intermediary of the ruling ideology in the ideological state apparatuses. We must go into the details of this difference, but it cannot mask the reality of a profound identity. To my knowledge, no class can hold state power over a long period without at the same time exercising its hegemony over and in the state ideological apparatuses. I only need one example and proof of this: Lenin's anguished concern to revolutionize the educational ideological state apparatus, among others, simply to make it possible for the Soviet proletariat, who had seized state power, to secure the future of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the transition to socialism. 10. This last comment puts us in a position to understand that the ideological state apparatuses may be not only the stake, but also the site of class struggle, and often of bitter forms of class struggle. The class, or class alliance, in power cannot lay down the law in the Isas as easily as it can in the repressive state apparatus, not only because the former ruling classes are able to retain strong positions there for a long time, but also because the resistance of the exploited classes is able to find means and occasions to express itself there, either by the utilization of their contradictions, or by conquering combat positions in them in struggle. 11. Let me run through my comments. If the thesis I have proposed is well founded, it leads me back to the classical Marxist theory of the state, while making it more precise in one point. I argue that it is necessary to distinguish between state power, and its possession by, on the one hand, and the state apparatus on the other. But I add that the state apparatus contains two bodies: the body of institutions which represent the repressive state apparatus on the one hand, and the body of institutions which represent the body of ideological state apparatuses on the other. But if this is the case, the following question is bound to be asked, even in the very summary state of my suggestions: what exactly is the extent of the role of the ideological state apparatuses? What is their importance based on? In other words, to what does the function of these ideological state apparatuses, which do not function by repression but by ideology, correspond? On the reproduction of the relations of production. I can now answer the central question which I have left in suspense for many long pages: how is the reproduction of the relations of production secured? In the topographical language, infrastructure, superstructure, I can say, for the most part 12 it is secured by the legal, political and ideological superstructure. But as I have argued that it is essential to go beyond this still descriptive language, I shall say, for the most part, it is secured by the exercise of state power in the state apparatuses, on the one hand the repressive state apparatus, on the other the ideological state apparatuses. What I have just said must also be taken into account, and it can be assembled in the form of the following three features. 1. All the state apparatuses function both by repression and by ideology, with the difference that the repressive state apparatus functions massively and predominantly by repression, whereas the ideological state apparatuses function massively and predominantly by ideology. 2. Whereas the repressive state apparatus constitutes an organized whole whose different parts are centralized beneath a commanding unity, that of the politics of class struggle applied by the political representatives of the ruling classes in possession of state power, the ideological state apparatuses are multiple, distinct, relatively autonomous and capable of providing an objective field to contradictions which express, in forms which may be limited or extreme, the effects of the clashes between the capitalist class struggle and the proletarian class struggle, as well as their subordinate forms. 3. Whereas the unity of the repressive state apparatus is secured by its unified and centralized organization under the leadership of the representatives of the classes in power executing the politics of the class struggle of the classes in power, the unity of the different ideological state apparatuses is secured, usually in contradictory forms, by the ruling ideology, the ideology of the ruling class. Taking these features into account, it is possible to represent the reproduction of the relations of production 13 in the following way, according to a kind of division of labor. The role of the repressive state apparatus, insofar as it is a repressive apparatus, consists essentially in securing by force, physical or otherwise, the political conditions of the reproduction of relations of production which are in the last resort relations of exploitation. Not only does the state apparatus contribute generously to its own reproduction, the capitalist state contains political dynasties, military dynasties, etc., but also and above all, the state apparatus secures by repression, from the most brutal physical force, via mere administrative commands and interdictions, to open and tacit censorship, the political conditions for the action of the ideological state apparatuses. In fact, it is the latter which largely secure the reproduction specifically of the relations of production, behind a shield provided by the repressive state apparatus. It is here that the role of the ruling ideology is heavily concentrated, the ideology of the ruling class, which holds state power. It is the intermediation of the ruling ideology that ensures a, sometimes teeth-gritting, harmony between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses, and between the different state ideological apparatuses. We are thus led to envisage the following hypothesis, as a function precisely of the diversity of ideological state apparatuses in their single, because shared, role of the reproduction of the relations of production. Indeed, we have listed a relatively large number of ideological state apparatuses in contemporary capitalist social formations: the educational apparatus, the religious apparatus, the family apparatus, the political apparatus, the trade union apparatus, the communications apparatus, the cultural apparatus, etc. But in the social formations of that mode of production characterized by serfdom, usually called the feudal mode of production, we observe that although there is a single repressive state apparatus which, since the earliest known ancient states, let alone the absolute monarchies, has been formally very similar to the one we know today, the number of ideological state apparatuses is smaller and their individual types are different. For example, we observe that during the Middle Ages, the Church, the religious ideological state apparatus, accumulated a number of functions which have today devolved onto several distinct ideological state apparatuses, new ones in relation to the past I am invoking, in particular educational and cultural functions. Alongside the Church there was the family ideological state apparatus, which played a considerable part, incommensurable with its role in capitalist social formations. Despite appearances, the Church and the family were not the only ideological state apparatuses. There was also a political ideological state apparatus, the Estates General, the Parliament, the different political factions and leagues, the ancestors of the modern political parties, and the whole political system of the free communes and then of the villes. There was also a powerful proto-trade union ideological state apparatus, if I may venture such an anachronistic term, the powerful merchants and bankers' guilds and the journeymen's associations, etc. Publishing and communications, even, saw an indisputable development, as did the theater. Initially both were integral parts of the church, then they became more and more independent of it. In the pre-capitalist historical period which I have examined extremely broadly, it is absolutely clear that there was one dominant ideological state apparatus, the church, which concentrated within it not only religious functions, but also educational ones, and a large proportion of the functions of communications and culture. It is no accident that all ideological struggle, from the 16th to the 18th century, starting with the first shocks of the Reformation, was concentrated in an anti-clerical and anti-religious struggle. Rather, this is a function precisely of the dominant position of the religious ideological state apparatus. The foremost objective and achievement of the French Revolution was not just to transfer state power from the feudal aristocracy to the merchant capitalist bourgeoisie, to break part of the former repressive state apparatus and replace it with a new one, example the National Popular Army, but also to attack the number one ideological state apparatus, the Church. Hence the civil constitution of the clergy, the confiscation of ecclesiastical wealth, and the creation of new ideological state apparatuses to replace the religious ideological state apparatus in its dominant role. Naturally, these things did not happen automatically. Witness the Concordat, the Restoration, and the long class struggle between the landed aristocracy and the industrial bourgeoisie throughout the 19th century for the establishment of bourgeois hegemony over the functions formerly fulfilled by the church, above all by the schools. It can be said that the bourgeoisie relied on the new political, parliamentary democratic, ideological state apparatus, installed in the earliest years of the revolution, then restored after long and violent struggles, for a few months in 1848 and for decades after the fall of the Second Empire, in order to conduct its struggle against the church and wrest its ideological functions away from it, in other words, to ensure not only its own political hegemony, but also the ideological hegemony, indispensable to the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. That is why I believe that I am justified in advancing the following thesis, however precarious it is. I believe that the ideological state apparatus which has been installed in the dominant position in mature capitalist social formations as a result of a violent political and ideological class struggle against the old dominant ideological state apparatus, is the educational ideological apparatus. This thesis may seem paradoxical, given that for everyone, i.e. in the ideological representation that the bourgeoisie has tried to give itself and the classes it exploits, it really seems that the dominant ideological state apparatus in capitalist social formations is not the schools, but the political ideological state apparatus, i.e. the regime of parliamentary democracy combining universal suffrage and party struggle. However, history, even recent history, shows that the bourgeoisie has been and still is able to accommodate itself to political ideological state apparatuses other than parliamentary democracy, the First and Second Empires, constitutional monarchy, Louis XVIII and Charles X, parliamentary monarchy, Louis Philippe, presidential democracy, de Gaulle, to mention only France. In England this is even clearer. The revolution was particularly successful there from the bourgeois point of view, since unlike France, where the bourgeoisie, partly because of the stupidity of the petty aristocracy, had to agree to being carried to power by peasant and plebeian journés révolutionnaires, something for which it had to pay a high price, the English bourgeoisie was able to compromise with the aristocracy and share state power and the use of the state apparatus with it for a long time, peace among all men of goodwill in the ruling classes. In Germany it is even more striking, since it was behind a political ideological state apparatus in which the imperial Junkers, epitomized by Bismarck, their army and their police provided it with a shield and leading personnel, that the imperialist bourgeoisie made its shattering entry into history, before traversing the Weimar Republic and entrusting itself to Nazism. Hence I believe I have good reasons for thinking that behind the scenes of its political ideological state apparatus, which occupies the front of the stage, what the bourgeoisie has installed as its number one, i.e. as its dominant ideological state apparatus, is the educational apparatus, which has in fact replaced in its functions the previously dominant ideological state apparatus, the church. One might even add, the school family couple has replaced the church family couple. Why is the educational apparatus in fact the dominant ideological state apparatus in capitalist social formations, and how does it function? For the moment it must suffice to say, 1. All ideological state apparatuses, whatever they are, contribute to the same result, the reproduction of the relations of production, i.e. of capitalist relations of exploitation. 2. Each of them contributes towards this single result in the way proper to it. The political apparatus by subjecting individuals to the political state ideology, the indirect, parliamentary, or direct, plebiscitary or fascist, democratic ideology. The communications apparatus by cramming every citizen with daily doses of nationalism, chauvinism, liberalism, moralism, etc., by means of the press, the radio, and television. The same goes for the cultural apparatus. The role of sport in chauvinism is of the first importance, etc. The religious apparatus by recalling in sermons and the other great ceremonies of birth, marriage, and death, that man is only ashes, unless he loves his neighbor to the extent of turning the other cheek to whoever strikes first. The family apparatus, but there is no need to go on. 3. This concert is dominated by a single score, occasionally disturbed by contradictions, those of the remnants of former ruling classes, those of the proletarians and their organizations, the score of the ideology of the current ruling class, which integrates into its music the great themes of the humanism of the great forefathers, who produced the Greek miracle even before Christianity, and afterwards the glory of Rome, the eternal city, and the themes of interest, particular and general, etc. nationalism, moralism, and economism. 4. Nevertheless, in this concert, one ideological state apparatus certainly has the dominant role, although hardly anyone lends an ear to its music, it is so silent. This is the school. It takes children from every class at infant school age, and then for years, the years in which the child is most vulnerable, squeezed between the family state apparatus and the educational state apparatus, it drums into them, whether it uses new or old methods, a certain amount of know-how wrapped in the ruling ideology, French, arithmetic, natural history, the sciences, literature, or simply the ruling ideology in its pure state, ethics, civic instruction, philosophy. Somewhere around the age of 16, a huge mass of children are ejected into production, these are the workers or small peasants. Another portion of scholastically adapted youth carries on, and, for better or worse, it goes somewhat further, until it falls by the wayside and fills the posts of small and middle technicians, white-collar workers, small and middle executives, petty bourgeois of all kinds. A last portion reaches the summit, either to fall into intellectual semi-employment, or to provide, as well as the intellectuals of the collective laborer, the agents of exploitation, capitalists, managers, the agents of repression, soldiers, policemen, politicians, administrators, etc., and the professional ideologists, priests of all sorts, most of whom are convinced laymen. Each mass ejected en route is practically provided with the ideology which suits the role it has to fulfill in class society, the role of the exploited, with a highly developed professional, ethical, civic, national, and apolitical consciousness, the role of the agent of exploitation, ability to give the workers orders and speak to them, human relations, of the agent of repression, ability to give orders and enforce obedience without discussion, or ability to manipulate the demagogy of a political leader's rhetoric, or of the professional ideologist, ability to treat consciousnesses with the respect, i.e. with the contempt, blackmail, and demagogy they deserve, adapted to the accents of morality, of virtue, of transcendence, of the nation, of France's world role, etc. Of course, many of these contrasting virtues, modesty, resignation, submissiveness on the one hand, cynicism, contempt, arrogance, confidence, self-importance, even smooth talk and cunning on the other, are also taught in the family, in the church, in the army, in good books, in films, and even in the football stadium. But no other ideological state apparatus has the obligatory, and not least, free, audience of the totality of the children in the capitalist social formation, 8 hours a day for 5 or 6 days out of 7. But it is by an apprenticeship in a variety of know-how wrapped up in the massive inculcation of the ideology of the ruling class that the relations of production in a capitalist social formation, i.e. the relations of exploited to exploiters and exploiters to exploited, are largely reproduced. The mechanisms which produce this vital result for the capitalist regime are naturally covered up and concealed by a universally reigning ideology of the school, universally reigning because it is one of the essential forms of the ruling bourgeois ideology, an ideology which represents the school as a neutral environment purged of ideology, because it is, where teachers respectful of the conscience and freedom of the children who are entrusted to them, in complete confidence, by their parents, who are free, to, i.e. the owners of their children, open up for them the path to the freedom, morality, and responsibility of adults by their own example, by knowledge, literature and their liberating virtues. I ask the pardon of those teachers who, in dreadful conditions, attempt to turn the few weapons they can find in the history and learning they teach against the ideology, the system, and the practices in which they are trapped. They are a kind of hero. But they are rare, and how many, the majority, do not even begin to suspect the work the system, which is bigger than they are and crushes them, forces them to do, or worse, put all their heart and ingenuity into performing it with the most advanced awareness, the famous new methods. So little do they suspect it that their own devotion contributes to the maintenance and nourishment of this ideological representation of the school, which makes the school today as natural, indispensable, useful, and even beneficial for our contemporaries as the church was natural, indispensable and generous for our ancestors a few centuries ago. In fact, the church has been replaced today in its role as the dominant ideological state apparatus by the school. It is coupled with the family just as the church was once coupled with the family. We can now claim that the unprecedentedly deep crisis which is now shaking the education system of so many states across the globe, often in conjunction with a crisis, already proclaimed in the Communist Manifesto, shaking the family system, takes on a political meaning, given that the school, and the school/family couple, constitutes the dominant ideological state apparatus, the apparatus playing a determinant part in the reproduction of the relations of production of a mode of production, threatened in its existence by the world-class struggle. On ideology. When I put forward the concept of an ideological state apparatus, when I said that the ISAs function by ideology, I invoked a reality which needs a little discussion: ideology. It is well known that the expression ideology was invented by Cabanis, Destutt de Tracy and their friends, who assigned to it as an object the genetic theory of ideas. When Marx took up the term 50 years later, he gave it a quite different meaning, even in his early works. Here, ideology is the system of the ideas and representations which dominate the mind of a man or a social group. The ideologico-political struggle conducted by Marx as early as his articles in the Renaissance inevitably and quickly brought him face to face with this reality and forced him to take his earliest intuitions further. However, here we come upon a rather astonishing paradox. Everything seems to lead Marx to formulate a theory of ideology. In fact, the German ideology does offer us, after the 1844 manuscripts, an explicit theory of ideology, but it is not Marxist. We shall see why in a moment. As for Capital, although it does contain many hints towards a theory of ideologies, most visibly, the ideology of the vulgar economists, it does not contain that theory itself, which depends for the most part on a theory of ideology in general. I should like to venture a first and very schematic outline of such a theory. The theses I am about to put forward are certainly not off the cuff, but they cannot be sustained and tested, i.e. confirmed or rejected, except by much thorough study and analysis. Ideology has no history. One word first of all to expound a reason in principle which seems to me to found, or at least to justify, the project of a theory of ideology in general, and not a theory of particular ideologies, which, whatever their form, religious, ethical, legal, political, always express class positions. It is quite obvious that it is necessary to proceed towards a theory of ideologies in the two respects I have just suggested. It will then be clear that a theory of ideologies depends in the last resort on the history of social formations, and thus of the modes of production combined in social formations, and of the class struggles which develop in them. In this sense it is clear that there can be no question of a theory of ideologies in general, since ideologies, defined in the double respect suggested above, regional and class, have a history, whose determination in the last instance is clearly situated outside ideologies alone, although it involves them. On the contrary, if I am able to put forward the project of a theory of ideology in general, and if this theory really is one of the elements on which theories of ideologies depend, that entails an apparently paradoxical proposition which I shall express in the following terms: ideology has no history. As we know, this formulation appears in so many words in a passage from the German Ideology. Marx utters it with respect to metaphysics, which, he says, has no more history than ethics, meaning also the other forms of ideology. In the German Ideology, this formulation appears in a plainly positivist context. Ideology is conceived as a pure illusion, a pure dream, i.e. as nothingness. All its reality is external to it. Ideology is thus thought as an imaginary construction whose status is exactly like the theoretical status of the dream among writers before Freud. For these writers, the dream was the purely imaginary, i.e. null, result of days residues, presented in an arbitrary arrangement and order, sometimes even inverted, in other words, in disorder. For them, the dream was the imaginary, it was empty, null, and arbitrarily stuck together, Bricole, once the eyes had closed, from the residues of the only full and positive reality, the reality of the day. This is exactly the status of philosophy and ideology, since in this book philosophy is ideology par excellence, in the German Ideology. Ideology, then, is for Marx an imaginary assemblage, bricolage, a pure dream, empty and vain, constituted by the day's residues from the only full and positive reality, that of the concrete history of concrete material individuals materially producing their existence. It is on this basis that ideology has no history in the German Ideology, since its history is outside it, where the only existing history is, the history of concrete individuals, etc. In the German Ideology, the thesis that ideology has no history is therefore a purely negative thesis, since it means both. One ideology is nothing insofar as it is a pure dream, manufactured by who knows what power, if not by the alienation of the division of labor, but that, too, is a negative determination. Two, ideology has no history, which emphatically does not mean that there is no history in it, on the contrary, for it is merely the pale, empty, and inverted reflection of real history, but that it has no history of its own. Now, while the thesis I wish to defend formally speaking adopts the terms of the German Ideology, ideology has no history, it is radically different from the positivist and historicist thesis of the German Ideology. For on the one hand, I think it is possible to hold that ideologies have a history of their own, although it is determined in the last instance by the class struggle, and on the other, I think it is possible to hold that ideology in general has no history, not in a negative sense, its history is external to it, but in an absolutely positive sense. This sense is a positive one if it is true that the peculiarity of ideology is that it is endowed with a structure and a functioning such as to make it a non-historical reality, i.e. an omni-historical reality, in the sense in which that structure and functioning are immutable, present in the same form throughout what we can call history, in the sense in which the Communist Manifesto defines history as the history of class struggles, i.e. the history of class societies. To give a theoretical reference point here, I might say that, to return to our example of the dream, in its Freudian conception this time, our proposition, Ideology has no history, can, and must, and in a way which has absolutely nothing arbitrary about it, but, quite the reverse, is theoretically necessary, for there is an organic link between the two propositions, be related directly to Freud's proposition that the unconscious is eternal, i.e. that it has no history. If eternal means, not transcendent to all, temporal, history, but omnipresent, transhistorical and therefore immutable in form throughout the extent of history, I shall adopt Freud's expression word for word, and write ideology is eternal, exactly like the unconscious. And I add that I find this comparison theoretically justified by the fact that the eternity of the unconscious is not unrelated to the eternity of ideology in general. That is why I believe I am justified, hypothetically at least, in proposing a theory of ideology in general, in the sense that Freud presented a theory of the unconscious in general. To simplify the phrase, it is convenient, taking into account what has been said about ideologies, to use the plain term ideology to designate ideology in general, which I have just said has no history, or, what comes to the same thing, is eternal, i.e. omnipresent in its immutable form throughout history, equals the history of social formations containing social classes. For the moment I shall restrict myself to class societies and their history. Ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. In order to approach my central thesis on the structure and functioning of ideology, I shall first present two theses, one negative, the other positive. The first concerns the object which is represented in the imaginary form of ideology, the second concerns the materiality of ideology. Thesis I. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. We commonly call religious ideology, ethical ideology, legal ideology, political ideology, etc., so many world outlooks. Of course, assuming that we do not live one of these ideologies as the truth, e.g. believe in God, duty, justice, etc., we admit that the ideology we are discussing from a critical point of view, examining it as the ethnologist examines the myths of a primitive society, that these world outlooks are largely imaginary, i.e. do not correspond to reality. However, while admitting that they do not correspond to reality, i.e. that they constitute an illusion, we admit that they do make allusion to reality, and that they need only be interpreted to discover the reality of the world behind their imaginary representation of that world. Ideology equals illusion/illusion. There are different types of interpretation, the most famous of which are the mechanistic type, current in the 18th century. God is the imaginary representation of the real king, and the hermeneutic interpretation, inaugurated by the earliest church fathers, and revived by Feuerbach and the theologico-philosophical school which descends from him, e.g. the theologian Barth, to Feuerbach, for example, God is the essence of real man. The essential point is that on condition that we interpret the imaginary transposition, and inversion, of ideology, we arrive at the conclusion that in ideology men represent their real conditions of existence to themselves in an imaginary form. Unfortunately, this interpretation leaves one small problem unsettled: why do men need this imaginary transposition of their real conditions of existence in order to represent to themselves their real conditions of existence? The first answer, that of the 18th century, proposes a simple solution: priests or despots are responsible. They forged the beautiful lie so that, in the belief that they were obeying God, men would in fact obey the priests and despots, who are usually in alliance in their imposture, the priests acting in the interests of the despots or vice versa, according to the political positions of the theoreticians concerned. There is therefore a cause for the imaginary transposition of the real conditions of existence. That causes the existence of a small number of cynical men who base their domination and exploitation of the people on a falsified representation of the world which they have imagined in order to enslave other minds by dominating their imaginations. The second answer, that of Feuerbach, taken over word for word by Marx in his early works, is more profound, i.e. just as false. It, too, seeks and finds a cause for the imaginary transposition and distortion of men's real conditions of existence, in short, for the alienation in the imaginary of the representation of men's conditions of existence. This cause is no longer priests or despots, nor their active imagination and the passive imagination of their victims. This cause is the material alienation which reigns in the conditions of existence of men themselves. This is how, in the Jewish question and elsewhere, Marx defends the Feuerbachian idea that men make themselves an alienated, imaginary, representation of their conditions of existence because these conditions of existence are themselves alienating, in the 1844 manuscripts, because these conditions are dominated by the essence of alienated society, alienated labor. All these interpretations thus take literally the thesis which they presuppose, and on which they depend, i.e. that what is reflected in the imaginary representation of the world found in an ideology is the conditions of existence of men, i.e. their real world. Now I can return to a thesis which I have already advanced: it is not their real conditions of existence, their real world, that men represent to themselves in ideology, but above all it is their relation to those conditions of existence which is represented to them there. It is this relation which is at the center of every ideological, i.e. imaginary, representation of the real world. It is this relation that contains the cause which has to explain the imaginary distortion of the ideological representation of the real world. Or rather, to leave aside the language of causality, it is necessary to advance the thesis that it is the imaginary nature of this relation which underlies all the imaginary distortion that we can observe, if we do not live in its truth, in all ideology. To speak in a Marxist language, if it is true that the representation of the real conditions of existence of the individuals occupying the posts of agents of production, exploitation, repression, ideologization and scientific practice, does in the last analysis arise from the relations of production, and from relations deriving from the relations of production, we can say the following: all ideology represents in its necessarily imaginary distortion not the existing relations of production, and the other relations that derive from them, but above all the imaginary relationship of individuals to the relations of production and the relations that derive from them. What is represented in ideology is therefore not the system of the real relations which govern the existence of individuals, but the imaginary relation of those individuals to the real relations in which they live. If this is the case, the question of the cause of the imaginary distortion of the real relations in ideology disappears and must be replaced by a different question: why is the representation given to individuals of their individual relation to the social relations which govern their conditions of existence and their collective and individual life necessarily an imaginary relation? And what is the nature of this imaginariness? Posed in this way, the question explodes the solution by a clique 14, by a group of individuals, priests or despots, who are the authors of the great ideological mystification, just as it explodes the solution by the alienated character of the real world. We shall see why later in my exposition. For the moment I shall go no further. Thesis 2: Ideology has a material existence. I have already touched on this thesis by saying that the ideas or representations, etc., which seem to make up ideology do not have an ideal or ideal, or spiritual existence, but a material existence. I even suggested that the ideal, and spiritual existence of ideas arises exclusively in an ideology of the idea and of ideology, and let me add, in an ideology of what seems to have founded this conception since the emergence of the sciences, i.e. what the practitioners of the sciences represent to themselves in their spontaneous ideology as ideas, true or false. Of course, presented in affirmative form, this thesis is unproven. I simply ask that the reader be favorably disposed towards it, say, in the name of materialism. A long series of arguments would be necessary to prove it. This hypothetical thesis of the not spiritual but material existence of ideas or other representations is indeed necessary if we are to advance in our analysis of the nature of ideology. Or rather, it is merely useful to us in order the better to reveal what every at all serious analysis of any ideology will immediately and empirically show to every observer, however critical. While discussing the ideological state apparatuses and their practices, I said that each of them was the realization of an ideology, the unity of these different regional ideologies, religious, ethical, legal, political, aesthetic, etc., being assured by their subjection to the ruling ideology. I now return to this thesis: an ideology always exists in an apparatus, and its practice, or practices. This existence is material. Of course, the material existence of the ideology in an apparatus and its practices does not have the same modality as the material existence of a paving stone or a rifle. But, at the risk of being taken for a neo-Aristotelian, N.B. Marx had a very high regard for Aristotle, I shall say that matter is discussed in many senses, or rather that it exists in different modalities, all rooted in the last instance in physical matter. Having said this, let me move straight on and see what happens to the individuals who live in ideology, i.e. in a determinate, religious, ethical, etc., representation of the world whose imaginary distortion depends on their imaginary relation to their conditions of existence, in other words, in the last instance, to the relations of production and to class relations. Ideology equals an imaginary relation to real relations. I shall say that this imaginary relation is itself endowed with a material existence. Now I observe the following. An individual believes in God, or duty, or justice, etc. This belief derives, for everyone, i.e. for all those who live in an ideological representation of ideology, which reduces ideology to ideas endowed by definition with a spiritual existence, from the ideas of the individual concerned, i.e. from him as a subject with a consciousness which contains the ideas of his belief. In this way, i.e. by means of the absolutely ideological conceptual device, dispositif, thus set up, a subject endowed with a consciousness in which he freely forms or freely recognizes ideas in which he believes, the material attitude of the subject concerned naturally follows. The individual in question behaves in such and such a way, adopts such and such a practical attitude, and, what is more, participates in certain regular practices which are those of the ideological apparatus on which depend the ideas which he has in all consciousness freely chosen as a subject. If he believes in God, he goes to church to attend Mass, kneels, prays, confesses, does penance, once it was material in the ordinary sense of the term, and naturally repents and so on. If he believes in duty, he will have the corresponding attitudes, inscribed in ritual practices according to the correct principles. If he believes in justice, he will submit unconditionally to the rules of the law, and may even protest when they are violated, sign petitions, take part in a demonstration, etc. Throughout this schema we observe that the ideological representation of ideology is itself forced to recognize that every subject endowed with a consciousness and believing in the ideas that his consciousness inspires in him and freely accepts, must act according to his ideas, must therefore inscribe his own ideas as a free subject in the actions of his material practice. If he does not do so, that is wicked. Indeed, if he does not do what he ought to do as a function of what he believes, it is because he does something else, which, still as a function of the same idealist scheme, implies that he has other ideas in his head as well as those he proclaims, and that he acts according to these other ideas, as a man who is either inconsistent, no one is willingly evil, or cynical, or perverse. In every case, the ideology of ideology thus recognizes, despite its imaginary distortion, that the ideas of a human subject exist in his actions, or ought to exist in his actions, and if that is not the case, it lends him other ideas corresponding to the actions, however perverse, that he does perform. This ideology talks of actions, I shall talk of actions inserted into practices. And I shall point out that these practices are governed by the rituals in which these practices are inscribed, within the material existence of an ideological apparatus, be it only a small part of that apparatus, a small mass in a small church, a funeral, a minor match at a sports club, a school day, a political party meeting, etc. Besides, we are indebted to Pascal's defensive dialectic for the wonderful formula which will enable us to invert the order of the notional schema of ideology. Pascal says more or less, kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe. He thus scandalously inverts the order of things, bringing, like Christ, not peace but strife, and in addition something hardly Christian, for woe to him who brings scandal into the world. Scandal itself. A fortunate scandal which makes him stick with Jansenist defiance to a language that directly names the reality. I will be allowed to leave Pascal to the arguments of his ideological struggle with the religious ideological state apparatus of his day. And I shall be expected to use a more directly Marxist vocabulary, if that is possible, for we are advancing in still poorly explored domains. I shall therefore say that, where only a single subject, such and such an individual, is concerned, the existence of the ideas of his belief is material in that his ideas are his material actions inserted into material practices governed by material rituals which are themselves defined by the material ideological apparatus from which derive the ideas of that subject. Naturally, the four inscriptions of the adjective material in my proposition must be affected by different modalities, the materialities of a displacement for going to Mass, of kneeling down, of the gesture of the sign of the cross, or of the mea culpa, of a sentence, of a prayer, of an act of contrition, of a penitence, of a gaze, of a handshake, of an external verbal discourse or an internal verbal discourse, consciousness, are not one and the same materiality. I shall leave on one side the problem of a theory of the differences between the modalities of materiality. It remains that in this inverted presentation of things, we are not dealing with an inversion at all, since it is clear that certain notions have purely and simply disappeared from our presentation, whereas others on the contrary survive, and new terms appear. Disappeared, the term ideas. Survive, the term subject, consciousness, belief, actions. Appear, the terms practices, rituals, ideological apparatus. It is therefore not an inversion or overturning, except in the sense in which one might say a government or a glass is overturned, but a reshuffle, of a non-ministerial type, a rather strange reshuffle, since we obtain the following result. Ideas have disappeared as such, insofar as they are endowed with an ideal or spiritual existence, to the precise extent that it has emerged that their existence is inscribed in the actions of practices governed by rituals defined in the last instance by an ideological apparatus. It therefore appears that the subject acts insofar as he is acted by the following system, set out in the order of its real determination: ideology existing in a material ideological apparatus, prescribing material practices governed by a material ritual, which practices exist in the material actions of a subject acting in all consciousness according to his belief. But this very presentation reveals that we have retained the following notions: subject, consciousness, belief, actions. From this series I shall immediately extract the decisive central term on which everything else depends, the notion of the subject. And I shall immediately set down two conjoint theses. 1. There is no practice except by and in an ideology. 2. There is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects. I can now come to my central thesis. Ideology interpellates individuals as subjects. This thesis is simply a matter of making my last proposition explicit: there is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects. Meaning, there is no ideology except for concrete subjects, and this destination for ideology is only made possible by the subject, meaning, by the category of the subject and its functioning. By this I mean that, even if it only appears under this name, the subject, with the rise of bourgeois ideology, above all with the rise of legal ideology, 15 the category of the subject, which may function under other names, example as the soul in Plato, as God, etc., is the constitutive category of all ideology, whatever its determination, regional or class, and whatever its historical date, since ideology has no history. I say, the category of the subject is constitutive of all ideology, but at the same time and immediately I add that the category of the subject is only constitutive of all ideology insofar as all ideology has the function, which defines it, of constituting concrete individuals as subjects. In the interaction of this double constitution exists the functioning of all ideology, ideology being nothing but its functioning in the material forms of existence of that functioning. In order to grasp what follows, it is essential to realize that both he who is writing these lines and the reader who reads them are themselves subjects, and therefore ideological subjects, a tautological proposition, i.e. that the author and the reader of these lines both live spontaneously or naturally in ideology in the sense in which I have said that man is an ideological animal by nature. That the author, insofar as he writes the lines of a discourse which claims to be scientific, is completely absent as a subject from his scientific discourse, for all scientific discourse is by definition a subject-less discourse, there is no subject of science except in an ideology of science, is a different question which I shall leave on one side for the moment. As St. Paul admirably put it, it is in the logos, meaning in ideology, that we live, move, and have our being. It follows that, for you and for me, the category of the subject is a primary obviousness. Obviousnesses are always primary. It is clear that you and I are subjects, free, ethical, etc. Like all obviousnesses, including those that make a word name a thing or have a meaning, therefore including the obviousness of the transparency of language, the obviousness that you and I are subjects, and that does not cause any problems, is an ideological effect, the elementary ideological effect. 16. It is indeed a peculiarity of ideology that it imposes, without appearing to do so, since these are obviousnesses as obviousnesses, which we cannot fail to recognize and before which we have the inevitable and natural reaction of crying out, aloud or in the still, small voice of conscience, that's obvious. That's right. That's true. At work in this reaction is the ideological recognition function, which is one of the two functions of ideology as such, its inverse being the function of misrecognition, meconnaissance. To take a highly concrete example, we all have friends who, when they knock on our door and we ask, through the door, the question "Who's there?" answer, since it's obvious, it's me. And we recognize that it is him, or her. We open the door, and it's true, it really was she who was there. To take another example, when we recognize somebody of our previous acquaintance, reconnaissance, in the street, we show him that we have recognized him, and have recognized that he has recognized us, by saying to him "Hello, my friend," and shaking his hand, a material ritual practice of ideological recognition in everyday life, in France, at least. Elsewhere, there are other rituals. In this preliminary remark and these concrete illustrations, I only wish to point out that you and I are always already subjects, and as such constantly practice the rituals of ideological recognition, which guarantee for us that we are indeed concrete, individual, distinguishable and, naturally, irreplaceable subjects. The writing I am currently executing and the reading you are currently 17 performing are also in this respect rituals of ideological recognition, including the obviousness with which the truth or error of my reflections may impose itself on you. But to recognize that we are subjects and that we function in the practical rituals of the most elementary everyday life, the handshake, the fact of calling you by your name, the fact of knowing, even if I do not know what it is, that you have a name of your own, which means that you are recognized as a unique subject, etc. This recognition only gives us the consciousness of our incessant, eternal, practice of ideological recognition, its consciousness, i.e. its recognition, but in no sense does it give us the scientific knowledge of the mechanism of this recognition. Now it is this knowledge that we have to reach, if you will, while speaking in ideology, and from within ideology we have to outline a discourse which tries to break with ideology, in order to dare to be the beginning of a scientific, i.e. subject-less, discourse on ideology. Thus, in order to represent why the category of the subject is constitutive of ideology, which only exists by constituting concrete subjects as subjects, I shall employ a special mode of exposition, concrete enough to be recognized, but abstract enough to be thinkable and thought, giving rise to a knowledge. As a first formulation I shall say, all ideology hails or interpellates concrete individuals as concrete subjects, by the functioning of the category of the subject. This is a proposition which entails that we distinguish for the moment between concrete individuals on the one hand and concrete subjects on the other, although at this level concrete subjects only exist insofar as they are supported by a concrete individual. I shall then suggest that ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals, it recruits them all, or transforms the individuals into subjects, it transforms them all, by that very precise operation which I have called interpellation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police, or other, hailing, hey, you there. 18. Assuming that the theoretical scene I have imagined takes place in the street, the hailed individual will turn round. By this mere 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject. Why? Because he has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him, and that it was really him who was hailed, and not someone else. Experience shows that the practical telecommunication of hailings is such that they hardly ever miss their man. Verbal call or whistle, the one hailed always recognizes that it is really him who is being hailed. And yet it is a strange phenomenon, and one which cannot be explained solely by guilt feelings, despite the large numbers who have something on their consciences. Naturally, for the convenience and clarity of my little theoretical theater, I have had to present things in the form of a sequence, with a before and an after, and thus in the form of a temporal succession. There are individuals walking along. Somewhere, usually behind them, the hail rings out, hey, you there. One individual, 9 times out of 10 it is the right one, turns round, believing/suspecting/knowing that it is for him, i.e. recognizing that it really is he who is meant by the hailing. But in reality these things happen without any succession. The existence of ideology and the hailing or interpellation of individuals as subjects are one and the same thing. I might add, what thus seems to take place outside ideology, to be precise, in the street, in reality takes place in ideology. What really takes place in ideology seems therefore to take place outside it. That is why those who are in ideology believe themselves by definition outside ideology. One of the effects of ideology is the practical denegation of the ideological character of ideology by ideology. Ideology never says, I am ideological. It is necessary to be outside ideology, i.e. in scientific knowledge, to be able to say, I am in ideology, a quite exceptional case, or, the general case I was in ideology. As is well known, the accusation of being in ideology only applies to others, never to oneself, unless one is really a Spinozist or a Marxist, which, in this matter, is to be exactly the same thing. Which amounts to saying that ideology has no outside, for itself, but at the same time that it is nothing but outside, for science and reality. Spinoza explained this completely 2 centuries before Marx, who practiced it but without explaining it in detail. But let us leave this point, although it is heavy with consequences which are not just theoretical, but also directly political, since, for example, the whole theory of criticism and self-criticism, the golden rule of the Marxist-Leninist practice of the class struggle, depends on it. Thus ideology hails or interpellates individuals as subjects. As ideology is eternal, I must now suppress the temporal form in which I have presented the functioning of ideology, and say, ideology has always already interpellated individuals as subjects, which amounts to making it clear that individuals are always already interpellated by ideology as subjects, which necessarily leads us to one last proposition: individuals are always already subjects. Hence individuals are abstract with respect to the subjects which they always already are. This proposition might seem paradoxical. That an individual is always already a subject, even before he is born, is nevertheless the plain reality, accessible to everyone and not a paradox at all. Freud shows that individuals are always abstract with respect to the subjects they always already are, simply by noting the ideological ritual that surrounds the expectation of a birth, that happy event. Everyone knows how much and in what way an unborn child is expected. Which amounts to saying, very prosaically, if we agree to drop the sentiments, i.e. the forms of family ideology, paternal/maternal conjugal/fraternal, in which the unborn child is expected, it is certain in advance that it will bear its father's name, and will therefore have an identity and be irreplaceable. Before its birth, the child is therefore always already a subject, appointed as a subject in and by the specific familial ideological configuration in which it is expected once it has been conceived. I hardly need add that this familial ideological configuration is, in its uniqueness, highly structured, and that it is in this implacable and more or less pathological, presupposing that any meaning can be assigned to that term, structure that the former subject to be will have to find its place, i.e. become the sexual subject, boy or girl, which it already is in advance. It is clear that this ideological constraint and pre-appointment, and all the rituals of rearing and then education in the family, have some relationship with what Freud studied in the forms of the pregenital and genital stages of sexuality, i.e. in the grip of what Freud registered by its effects as being the unconscious. But let us leave this point, too, on one side. Let me go one step further. What I shall now turn my attention to is the way the actors in this mise-en-scene setting of interpellation, and their respective roles, are reflected in the very structure of all ideology. An example, the Christian religious ideology. As the formal structure of all ideology is always the same, I shall restrict my analysis to a single example, one accessible to everyone, that of religious ideology, with the proviso that the same demonstration can be produced for ethical, legal, political, aesthetic ideology, etc. Let us therefore consider the Christian religious ideology. I shall use a rhetorical figure and make it speak, i.e. collect into a fictional discourse what it says not only in its two testaments, its theologians, sermons, but also in its practices, its rituals, its ceremonies, and its sacraments. The Christian religious ideology says something like this. It says, I address myself to you, a human individual called Peter. Every individual is called by his name, in the passive sense. It is never he who provides his own name, in order to tell you that God exists and that you are answerable to him. It adds, God addresses himself to you through my voice, Scripture having collected the word of God, tradition having transmitted it, papal infallibility fixing it forever on nice points. It says, this is who you are Peter. This is your origin, you were created by God for all eternity, although you were born in the 1920th year of our Lord. This is your place in the world. This is what you must do. By these means, if you observe the law of love you will be saved, you, Peter, and will become part of the glorious body of Christ. Etc. Now this is quite a familiar and banal discourse, but at the same time quite a surprising one. Surprising because if we consider that religious ideology is indeed addressed to individuals 19 in order to transform them into subjects, by interpellating the individual, Peter, in order to make him a subject, free to obey or disobey the appeal, i.e. God's commandments, if it calls these individuals by their names, thus recognizing that they are always already interpellated as subjects with a personal identity, to the extent that Pascal's Christ says, it is for you that I have shed this drop of my blood, if it interpellates them in such a way that the subject responds, yes, it really is me, if it obtains from them the recognition that they really do occupy the place it designates for them as theirs in the world, a fixed residence, it really is me, I am here, a worker, a boss or a soldier, in this vale of tears, if it obtains from them the recognition of a destination, eternal life or damnation, according to the respect or contempt they show to God's commandments, law. Become love. If everything does happen in this way, in the practices of the well-known rituals of baptism, confirmation, communion, confession, and extreme unction, etc. We should note that all this procedure to set up Christian religious subjects is dominated by a strange phenomenon, the fact that there can only be such a multitude of possible religious subjects on the absolute condition that there is a unique, absolute, other subject, i.e. God. It is convenient to designate this new and remarkable subject by writing subject with a capital S to distinguish it from ordinary subjects, with a small s. It then emerges that the interpellation of individuals as subjects presupposes the existence of a unique and central other subject, in whose name the religious ideology interpellates all individuals as subjects. All this is clearly written in what is rightly called the Scriptures. And it came to pass at that time that God the Lord, Yahweh, spoke to Moses in the cloud. And the Lord cried to Moses, Moses. And Moses replied, It is, really, I am Moses thy servant, speak and I shall listen. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said to him, I am that I am. God thus defines himself as the subject par excellence, he who is through himself and for himself, I am that I am, and he who interpellates his subject, the individual subjected to him by his very interpellation, i.e. the individual named Moses. And Moses, interpellated called by his name, having recognized that it really was he who was called by God, recognizes that he is a subject of God, a subject subjected to God, a subject through the subject and subjected to the subject. The proof, he obeys him, and makes his people obey God's commandments. God is thus the subject, and Moses and the innumerable subjects of God's people, the subject's interlocutors interpellates, his mirrors, his reflections. Were not men made in the image of God? As all theological reflection proves, whereas he could perfectly well have done without men, God needs them, the subject needs the subjects, just as men need God, the subjects need the subject. Better, God needs men, the great subject needs subjects, even in the terrible inversion of his image in them, when the subjects wallow in debauchery, i.e. sin. Better, God duplicates himself and sends his Son to the earth, as a mere subject forsaken by him, the long complaint of the Garden of Olives which ends in the crucifixion, subject but subject, man but God, to do what prepares the way for the final redemption, the resurrection of Christ. God thus needs to make himself a man, the subject needs to become a subject, as if to show empirically, visibly to the eye, tangibly to the hands, see St. Thomas, of the subjects, that, if they are subjects, subjected to the subject, that is solely in order that finally, on Judgment Day, they will re-enter the Lord's bosom, like Christ, i.e. re-enter the subject. 21. Let us decipher into theoretical language this wonderful necessity for the duplication of the subject into subjects and of the subject itself into a subject's subject. We observe that the structure of all ideology, interpellating individuals as subjects in the name of a unique and absolute subject is speculary, i.e. a mirror structure, and doubly speculary. This mirror duplication is constitutive of ideology and ensures its functioning. Which means that all ideology is centered, that the absolute subject occupies the unique place of the center, and interpellates around it the infinity of individuals into subjects in a double mirror connection such that it subjects the subjects to the subject, while giving them in the subject in which each subject can contemplate its own image, present and future, the guarantee that this really concerns them and him, and that since everything takes place in the family, the Holy Family, the family is in essence holy, God will recognize his own in it, i.e. those who have recognized God, and have recognized themselves in him, will be saved. Let me summarize what we have discovered about ideology in general. The duplicate mirror structure of ideology ensures simultaneously 1. The interpellation of individuals as subjects. 2. Their subjection to the subject. 3. The mutual recognition of subjects and subject, the subject's recognition of each other, and finally the subject's recognition of himself. 22. 4. The absolute guarantee that everything really is so, and that on condition that the subjects recognize what they are and behave accordingly, everything will be alright, amen, so be it. Result, caught in this quadruple system of interpellation as subjects, of subjection to the subject, of universal recognition and of absolute guarantee, the subjects work, they work by themselves in the vast majority of cases, with the exception of the bad subjects who on occasion provoke the intervention of one of the detachments of the repressive state apparatus. But the vast majority of good subjects work all right all by themselves, i.e. by ideology, whose concrete forms are realized in the ideological state apparatuses. They are inserted into practices governed by the rituals of the Isis. They recognize the existing state of affairs, das Bestehend, that it really is true that it is so and not otherwise, and that they must be obedient to God, to their conscience, to the priest, to De Gaulle, to the boss, to the engineer, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, etc. Their concrete, material behavior is simply the inscription in life of the admirable words of the prayer, Amen, so be it. Yes, the subjects work by themselves. The whole mystery of this effect lies in the first two moments of the quadruple system I have just discussed, or, if you prefer, in the ambiguity of the term subject. In the ordinary use of the term, subject in fact means, 1. A free subjectivity, a center of initiatives, author of and responsible for its actions, 2. A subjected being, who submits to a higher authority, and is therefore stripped of all freedom except that of freely accepting his submission. This last note gives us the meaning of this ambiguity, which is merely a reflection of the effect which produces it. The individual is interpellated as a free subject in order that he shall submit freely to the commandments of the subject, i.e. in order that he shall, freely, accept his subjection, i.e. in order that he shall make the gestures and actions of his subjection all by himself. There are no subjects except by and for their subjection. That is why they work all by themselves. So be it. This phrase which registers the effect to be obtained proves that it is not naturally so, naturally, outside the prayer, i.e. outside the ideological intervention. This phrase proves that it has to be so if things are to be what they must be, and let us let the word slip, if the reproduction of the relations of production is to be assured, even in the processes of production and circulation, every day, in the consciousness, i.e. in the attitudes of the individual subjects occupying the posts which the socio-technical division of labor assigns to them in production, exploitation, repression, ideologization, scientific practice, etc. Indeed, what is really in question in this mechanism of the mirror recognition of the subject and of the individuals interpellated as subjects, and of the guarantee given by the subject to the subjects if they freely accept their subjection to the subject's commandments. The reality in question in this mechanism, the reality which is necessarily ignored, mekanua, in the very forms of recognition, ideology equals misrecognition/ignorance, is indeed, in the last resort, the reproduction of the relations of production and of the relations deriving from them. January-April 1969. P.S. If these few schematic theses allow me to illuminate certain aspects of the functioning of the superstructure and its mode of intervention in the infrastructure, they are obviously abstract and necessarily leave several important problems unanswered, which should be mentioned. 1. The problem of the total process of the realization of the reproduction of the relations of production. As an element of this process, the Isis contribute to this reproduction. But the point of view of their contribution alone is still an abstract one. It is only within the processes of production and circulation that this reproduction is realized. It is realized by the mechanisms of those processes, in which the training of the workers is completed, their posts assigned them, etc. It is in the internal mechanisms of these processes that the effect of the different ideologies is felt, above all the effect of legal ethical ideology. But this point of view is still an abstract one. For in a class society the relations of production are relations of exploitation, and therefore relations between antagonistic classes. The reproduction of the relations of production, The ultimate aim of the ruling class cannot therefore be a merely technical operation training and distributing individuals for the different posts in the technical division of labor. In fact, there is no technical division of labor except in the ideology of the ruling class. Every technical division, every technical organization of labor is the form and mask of a social, equals class, division and organization of labor. The reproduction of the relations of production can therefore only be a class undertaking. It is realized through a class struggle which counterposes the ruling class and the exploited class. The total process of the realization of the reproduction of the relations of production is therefore still abstract, insofar as it has not adopted the point of view of this class struggle. To adopt the point of view of reproduction is therefore in the last instance, to adopt the point of view of the class struggle. 2. The problem of the class nature of the ideologies existing in a social formation. The mechanism of ideology in general is one thing. We have seen that it can be reduced to a few principles expressed in a few words, as poor as those which, according to Marx, define production in general, or in Freud, define the unconscious in general. If there is any truth in it, this mechanism must be abstract with respect to every real ideological formation. I have suggested that the ideologies were realized in institutions, in their rituals and their practices, in the ISAs. We have seen that on this basis they contribute to that form of class struggle, vital for the ruling class, the reproduction of the relations of production. But the point of view itself, however real, is still an abstract one. In fact, the state and its apparatuses only have meaning from the point of view of the class struggle, as an apparatus of class struggle ensuring class oppression and guaranteeing the conditions of exploitation and its reproduction. But there is no class struggle without antagonistic classes. Whoever says class struggle of the ruling class says resistance, revolt, and class struggle of the ruled class. That is why the ISAs are not the realization of ideology in general, nor even the conflict-free realization of the ideology of the ruling class. The ideology of the ruling class does not become the ruling ideology by the grace of God, nor even by virtue of the seizure of state power alone. It is by the installation of the ISAs in which this ideology is realized and realizes itself that it becomes the ruling ideology. But this installation is not achieved all by itself. On the contrary, it is the stake in a very bitter and continuous class struggle, first against the former ruling classes and their positions in the old and new ISAs, then against the exploited class. But this point of view of the class struggle in the ISAs is still an abstract one. In fact, the class struggle in the ISAs is indeed an aspect of the class struggle, sometimes an important and symptomatic one, e.g. the anti-religious struggle in the 18th century, or the crisis of the educational ISA in every capitalist country today. But the class struggles in the ISAs is only one aspect of a class struggle which goes beyond the ISAs. The ideology that a class in power makes the ruling ideology in its ISAs is indeed realized in those ISAs, but it goes beyond them, for it comes from elsewhere. Similarly, the ideology that a ruled class manages to defend in and against such ISAs goes beyond them, for it comes from elsewhere. It is only from the point of view of the classes, i.e. of the class struggle, that it is possible to explain the ideologies existing in a social formation. Not only is it from this starting point that it is possible to explain the realization of the ruling ideology in the ISAs and of the forms of class struggle for which the ISAs are the seat and the stake. But it is also and above all from this starting point that it is possible to understand the provenance of the ideologies which are realized in the ISAs and confront one another there. For if it is true that the ISAs represent the form in which the ideology of the ruling class must necessarily be realized, and the form in which the ideology of the ruled class must necessarily be measured and confronted, ideologies are not born in the ISAs but from the social classes at grips in the class struggle, from their conditions of existence, their practices, their experience of the struggle, etc. April 1970.
Range up. Speed. Range up. Two of spades.